In the last week of September, when the flax had been pulled and threshed and the bright brown seed hauled off in sacks to the oil mill at Vernon Landing, the farmers of Quill Creek Township burned their straw, and the smoke of it stood up over the bottomland in a dozen slow gray columns that all leaned the same way with the river wind. It was a thing done every autumn, and done cheerfully, the way a man burns brush or scours a chimney, and there was no meanness in it, only habit. The flax was grown for its seed and for nothing else. The oil mill wanted the seed and paid in silver for it, $1 and a fraction the bushel depending on the year and the man weighing. And what the mill did not want was the long tangled straw that came off the threshing floor in ropey mats that fouled the harrow, choked the manure fork, would not rot down in a season, and turned any field they were spread on into a felted mess that a plow rode over instead of through. So the straw was raked into ricks at the field corners and left through the dry weeks. And then on a still evening in the last of September, a man walked down the row with a lantern or a twist of burning paper and let the whole year's fever go up in a smell like scorched hair, and stood watching with his hands in his pockets while his boys ran the edges with wet sacks to keep the fire off the fence rails. Nobody in the township thought of it as waste, because waste is a thing you could have used. Straw was straw. Fire was cheap. That was the whole of the reasoning, and for 30 years it had been reasoning enough. Almira Teague did not burn hers. She stood at the rail fence at the top of her home lot on the last evening of the burning, a woman of 34 in a black dress gone brown at the elbows, with her hair pinned up under a faded sunbonnet she did not take off even at dusk, and she watched the columns come up one after another all down the creek, Dorset's first, because Dorset always went first, then Ruel Peak's, then the two Vandergrift brothers who burned together because their fields touched, then the little smudge from the Wicklow place that was hardly worth the name of a fire. And she counted them the way another woman might count the lamps coming on in a town. Behind her, in the stubble of her own 9 acres, her flax straw lay in 11 ricks with old rails laid over their crowns to keep the wind from stripping them, and there was no lantern going down that row, and there would not be. Her boy, Perry, who was 12 that fall, and already had his father's long forearms and none of his father's patience, had asked 3 times in 3 days when they would fire the ricks, because the firing was the one part of the flax year a boy looked forward to, and 3 times she had told him they would not, and the 3rd time she had told him why, and he had gone off to the woodpile and split kindling for an hour with more force than the kindling required. Her girl Junia, who was 8, had not asked, because Junia had learned earlier than her brother that her mother's silences on a subject were the settled kind. The Teague place ran to 41 acres on the second bench above Quill Creek, sandy at the top where the old channel had cut and heavy black at the bottom, with a house of squared logs sided over in poplar boards, a barn her husband had raised the year Junia was born, a spring house, and a note at the bank in Vernon Landing for $340 that came due the 1st of April in 1863 and drew 10% until it did. Eben Teague had put his name to that note in a good year, for a team and a breaking plow and a stand of young apple trees, and he had every intention of paying it out of the flaxseed and the corn, and he would have most likely if a load of white oak butts had not shifted off the sled on the river hill in the February of 1859 and come down on him in the space of about 2 seconds, while the near horse stood in the traces and shook. He was 38. He had been a careful man about most things and careless about chains, and the township said so at the funeral in the gentle way people say such things, and then went home. What was left to Almira was the 41 acres, the note, the 2 children, a team, 9 head of hogs, a cow with a bad quarter, and a general expectation among her neighbors that she would sell out by the 2nd summer and go to her sister at Madison. She did not sell out. She rented the far 12 to Ruel Peak on the 3rds, put the rest into corn and flax and a garden, and got through the 1st year on a kind of grim arithmetic that left nothing over, and got through the 2nd the same way, and by the autumn of 1860 she had paid the interest twice and not $1 of the principal. And she knew as well as the bank did what that meant if a third year went the same road. It was in the middle of that knowledge that she stopped burning her straw. She had not come to it suddenly. She had come to it the way a person comes to any idea that arrives dressed as a memory. All that summer, walking the flax when it was in blue flower and again when it went the pale gold that meant it was time, she had been thinking of her mother's hands, and of a thing that had hung on the wall of the kitchen in the house where she was raised, up in the hill country of the next county, a thing of iron teeth set in a block of oak that no visitor had ever been able to name at first sight. Almira's mother had come out of Coleraine in the north of Ireland in 1822 with a chest, a Bible, and that block of teeth wrapped in a shawl, and had carried it 400 miles inland to a country where nobody wanted it, and had never once in 40 years used it for its purpose, and had never once let it be sold or broken up or given to a blacksmith for the metal. It was a hackle. It was the course of a pair, 30-odd spikes to the row, ground and set by a man in a linen town where every third house had a loom in it, and it existed for one job in the world, which was to comb the last of the woody trash out of a hank of retted flax fibre and lay the long strands parallel so a woman could spin them into thread fine enough to be sold by the yard instead of by the pound. Almira had been shown its use once, on a handful of fibre her mother had produced from somewhere when she was 9 or 10. She remembered the sound of it more than the sight, a dry hard shur like a broom drawn across sand, and she remembered her mother's face going strange and young for a moment and then closing again. She remembered being told that where her mother came from, the straw was the crop and the seed was the leaving, and that a man there who burned his straw would have been thought to have lost his mind, and that whole parishes lived the winter through on what came off the swingle board. And she remembered asking why nobody here did it, and being told, without bitterness, that here there was cotton, and cotton was cheap, and a thing that is cheap makes the labor of the thing it replaces look like foolishness. Wilbur Dorset found out about the ricks on the 2nd of October when he came down the creek road with a load of seed sacks and saw them still standing with their rails on, and he pulled up his team and looked at them for a while with the pleased expression of a man who has been handed a subject. Dorset farmed 310 acres on the ridge and grew more flaxseed than any 2 men in the township, and he was not a cruel neighbor by his own accounting. He had sent a hand down to help Almira with her corn the first fall after Eben died, and had refused payment for it, and he told that story often. But he had a wide, flat voice that carried at the store and the mill and the schoolhouse meetings, and he had the particular certainty of a man who has never had to be wrong in public. And when he came upon a thing he did not understand, he made a joke of it, and the joke went around the township faster than the truth ever could. He called out to her across the fence that she had better hurry or she would lose her light, and when she answered that she was not burning, he laughed and said that a woman who saved flax straw would save the smoke too if she could find a jar to hold it. By the end of that week the phrase had gone up and down Quill Creek, and men who had not laid eyes on the Teague ricks were saying that the widow was farming smoke, and by the end of the month it had been shortened to the shape it kept for 2 years, which was simply that Almira Teague was saving trash, and the word trash did most of the work. She let it go by. What she did instead was walk 2.5 miles up the creek to the Broughton place, where a Norwegian family had come in 1854 and had never quite been absorbed, and she sat in Ottilie Broughton's kitchen for 3 hours with a cup of coffee going cold in front of her, and asked questions about linen until the older woman began to laugh at her, not unkindly, and got up and pulled out from under a bed a bundle wrapped in sacking that turned out to be a flax brake. A handbrake of ash with a hinged 3-bladed jaw, made by Ottilie's husband in the first year they were on the land, and used precisely twice. Ottilie Broughton had grown up on a farm above a yord where flax was retted in a pond that had been dug for that purpose before her grandmother was born, and she had come to Indiana and found a country where flax was a seed crop and the fibre was a bonfire. And she had thought about it for 7 years and had said nothing, because she had learned in her first winter what happened to an opinion in an accent. She told Almira the whole of it in an afternoon, and then told it again the next week more slowly, while Almira wrote in a copybook with a pencil she had to keep sharpening. The first thing was that the flax must be pulled and not cut. Almira already pulled hers, as most of the township did, but for the wrong reason, which was that pulling shuck less seed loose. The right reason was that the fiber in a flax stalk runs the whole length of it from the root crown up, and a scythe or a cradle takes 6 inches off the bottom of every strand and turns a hank of line into a hank of short stuff worth a third as much. The second thing was rippling, which meant drawing the pulled handfuls through an iron comb set upright in a plank so the seed bowls came off clean before anything else happened, and this the township did badly and by machine because it only cared about the seed. The third thing, and the thing that made the difference between Fribre and trash, was retting. Retting was rot, controlled and stopped at the right hour. In the stalk of a flax plant, the useful fiber lies in bundles just under the skin, glued to the woody core by a gum, and no beating or breaking on earth will separate them until that gum has been eaten away by water and bacteria and time. Leave the straw dry, and it stays one thing forever. Wet it too briefly, and the fiber comes off in short raggy lengths still bound to shiv. Wet it too long, and the rot goes on past the gum and into the fiber itself, and you have a barn full of gray wool that pulls apart in the hand and is fit for nothing but stuffing a horse collar. The whole art was in the stopping. Ottilie said her grandmother could tell by the feel of a stalk between thumb and nail, and that she herself could do it in an ordinary season by taking a few stems out every morning after the 4th day, snapping the wood at the middle, and seeing whether the fibre slipped off the break clean and whole like a peeled willow wand, and that a person who did that faithfully every morning for 2 weeks would know more than a person who had read about it for 10 years. In the last week of October 1860, Almira Teague and her son dug a pond. It was not much of a pond. It was a shallow oblong at the foot of the home lot where a wet seep already ran 40 feet by 18, deepened to a little over 3 feet and puddled on the bottom and sides with the blue clay out of the creek bank until it would hold. It took them 9 days between other work, and Perry was surly for 6 of them and stopped being surly on the 7th for reasons of his own that had mostly to do with having built something. They floored it with old rails to keep the bundles off the mud, and they weighted the bundles down with flat stones from the creek so no part of any sheaf could lift above the water and dry out and ret unevenly. Then they carried in the straw from 3 of the 11 ricks, which was all the pond would take at one time. And Almira began going down at first light every morning with a lard tin to hold the test stems. The rest of the straw stayed under its rails in the field and waited its turn, and she learned by that first winter that straw properly ricked and topped would keep 2 years and lose nothing, which was a fact worth more to her later than anything else she learned that season. The pond smelled. That was the part nobody had thought to warn her about, and the part that nearly finished the whole business before it began. Retting water on the 4th and 5th day begins to work, and by the 8th day a 40-foot pool of steeping flax puts out a smell that is not like manure or like a dead animal, but is worse than either in a particular Swedish way that gets into cloth and hair. And on a still evening, with the air settling into the bottomland, it traveled a half-mile up the creek road. Reuel Peak spoke to her about it civilly. Dorset did not speak to her at all, but spoke to 2 of the 3 township trustees, and in the 2nd week of November, a man named Judah Hollis, who kept the store at the crossroads and served as trustee because nobody else wanted the trouble, came out to the Teague place on a cold afternoon with his coat collar up and stood at the edge of the water looking miserable, being a decent man on an errand he had not chosen. Hollis told her there had been a complaint of nuisance, and that he was obliged to look at the thing and report on it, and Almira showed him everything without argument. The pond and the stones and the lard tin of test stems and the copybook with the dates in it, and she asked him only one question, which was whether the complaint was of the smell or of the woman. Hollis, who had been keeping her account at the store for 2 years and knew to the cent what she paid down and how, looked at the water a while longer and then said that the law on nuisance concerned itself with hog lots and slaughter offal and standing filth, and that he would report that the widow Teague was steeping a crop, which was farming, and that any man who could stand a hemp pool or a tan yard could stand this. Then he said in the voice of a man giving away something he was not obliged to give, that she might move her pool below the fence line into the old oxbow where the ground fell away and the air drained south, and nobody in the township would ever smell it again. She moved it that same month. It cost her another 11 days of digging in cold clay, and it settled the question for good, and Judah Hollis never once mentioned the favor afterward, and Almira never forgot it, and the two facts together made the only piece of luck in the whole affair. The winter work began in December, and it was the hardest labor she had ever done in her life. Harder than corn, harder than butchering, harder than the first winter after Eben. Retted straw must be dried bone-dry before it will break, so the bundles came out of the pool black and stinking and were stood in stooks in the field to drain and then hauled into the barn loft and spread thin on the joists with the barn doors opened on every dry day. And turned again, and when a rain came in, they closed it up and lost 3 days. Dry straw goes to the brake. The brake is a simple, violent machine, a wooden jaw of 2 or 3 blades hinged at one end that a person lifts and slams down onto a handful of stalks laid across matching blades below, and the job is to shatter the woody core into short brittle pieces called shiv while leaving the fiber bundles unharmed, which is possible only because the fiber is flexible and the wood is not. It is done standing, with the whole weight of the shoulders, 40 or 50 strokes to the handful, and a woman who breaks flax all day cannot lift a full bucket that evening. Almira broke on Ottilie Broughton's ash brake for the first 3 weeks, and then Perry, who at 12 was jealous of the machine, built a second one out of the front rails of a broken hay ladder with a hinge pin off a gate, and it was clumsy and worked, and after that they broke together in the shed with the doors shut against the wind and the shiv piling up around their boots to the ankle. Then, scutching. Scutching is the removal of the shattered shiv from the fiber, done by hanging the broken handful over the notched edge of an upright board and beating it downward with a flat wooden knife. A long paddle of thin hardwood, so the loose wood is knocked out and falls, and the fiber is drawn cleaner with every stroke. It makes a noise like slow applause, and it fills the air with a fine pale dust that settles on everything within 20 feet and gets into the throat, and both of them coughed all that January, and Junia coughed worst, so Almira hung wet sheets across the shed and set the girl to the sorting instead, which was a job of hands and eyes and not of lungs. Last came the hackling, and for the hackling Almira drove up into the hill country in the first week of February and came back with her mother's block of iron teeth on the seat beside her wrapped in the same shawl, and with a finer one bought for $2.25 from an old man at Pisgah who had it off a Pennsylvania family and had used it to cardwill badly for 11 years. Hackling is the finishing. The handful is thrown down onto the teeth and drawn through, coarse comb first and fine comb after, and each pass rips out more of the short tangled fiber and the last of the shive, and leaves in the hand a shining hank of long parallel strands the color of new rope and the weight of nothing at all, and this is line, the good fiber. The thing that is sold by the pound at a price that means something. What comes away in the teeth is tow, short and snarled, worth less, but worth a good deal more than ash, being the stuff of twine and coarse sacking and candle wick and rope yarn. That first winter, out of the 11 ricks off 9 acres, Almira Teague and her 2 children produced 490 pounds of dressed line and something over 600 pounds of tow, and she had no earthly idea what to do with any of it. That was the winter the township enjoyed most. It is one thing to be laughed at for an intention, and another to be laughed at for a result. And the result, in the spring of 1861, was 1,100 pounds of feebry in a barn in a country that had no linen mill and no linen buyer, and had not had one within 100 miles since before the canal. She wrote to 3 houses in Cincinnati out of an old directory at the store and got 2 answers, both polite, both saying the same thing in different words, which was that the trade in domestic flax fibre was small and irregular and that they were fully supplied. A man came out from Vernon Landing in April who had heard there was cheap bedding to be had and offered her $9 for the whole of the tow, and she thanked him and let him drive off empty. Dorset, at the store in May in front of 6 men and Judah Hollis, offered her $1.50 to haul the mess out of her barn before it took fire, and said it slowly enough that everybody could get the good of it. Almira said that she would keep it, and that she thanked him, and she bought her salt and went home, and Junia, who was in the wagon, cried for 2 miles and was told that crying at a joke is how a joke learns it has worked. In June, a fire got away from a burn-off on the Vandergrift place and ran a 1/4 mile down the fence line in dry grass and stopped at the road. And Almira stood in her lot that evening looking at her barn with the whole of her labor in it and understood a thing about eggs and baskets. And the next week she and Perry plowed a double furrow 12 feet wide the entire way around the barn lot and the rick field, and dragged it bare, and kept it bare for 2 years, and it was the ugliest piece of ground in the township and the only one that never worried her again. And then, in the autumn of 1861, when the smoke columns went up along the creek as they always did, Almira Teague hitched the team and drove from farm to farm with an empty wagon and asked the men of Quill Creek Township to give her the straw they were about to burn. She went to 19 farms in 11 days. She took Perry to load, and she took her copybook, and at every place she made the same short speech that she would take the straw off the field herself, that she would leave the ground raked clean, that she would pay for it if the man wanted paying, and be glad of it for nothing if he did not. Most of them gave it to her outright and helped her fork it on, some out of kindness and some because it saved them an evening's work and a small risk of fire, and 4 of them, having heard the joke at the store and wanting to be in on it, charged her 10 cents a load and told the story afterward. She paid the 10 cents each time without comment and wrote the amount in the copybook. It came to $4.40 across the whole of that autumn, and it was the cheapest raw material any manufacturer in the state of Indiana bought that year. She had put 14 acres of her own into flax that spring as well, having borrowed against nothing and stinted on everything to buy the seed, so that between her own crop and the 19 farms she brought home in 6 weeks something in the neighborhood of 30 tons of straw, and it filled the barn and the shed and the corn crib and stood in ricks all down the bare-plowed lot under rails and old canvas. And the neighbors who drove past on the creek road that November looked at it the way people look at a thing that has gone from ridiculous to slightly unsettling. She could not ret it all in one pool. She dug 2 more in the oxbow, and she staggered them, one going in as another came out, from the middle of October until the water skinned over hard in the 2nd week of December and would not work any longer. And she learned that fall, that cold water rets slow and clean, and warm water rets fast and dangerous, and she filled 11 pages of the copybook with dates and water temperatures taken, by hand and nothing else, because she had no thermometer and would not have known what to do with the numbers if she had. She hired the 2 Wicklow girls, whose father had gone to the war in the summer and left them a hillside and a mortgage, and she paid them in fibre and in meat and in 1 silver $half a week each, which was more than a girl got for housework in that county and less than the work was worth. And all 3 of them said so plainly, and the arrangement held for 2 years without a crossword. They broke and scutched and hackled from December to the end of March in the shed with the wet sheets hung, and they took Sundays, and by the 1st of April in 1862 there was, in the loft of a barn on 41 acres above Quill Creek, something over 3,000 pounds of dressed flax fibre with nobody in the world wanting to buy it. What happened next did not happen because of anything Almira Teague did. It happened 800 miles away, and it had been coming for a year, and she had read the edges of it in the county paper without understanding that it had her name on it. The war had shut the river and then the ports. cotton which had come up the Mississippi and the Ohio in bales for as long as anybody in the township had been alive, and which had been so cheap for so long that a woman thought nothing of buying calico by the bolt, simply stopped coming. The southern fields that were not fought over were planted to corn by men who had no way to move a bale to a wharf, and the worm took a good deal of what was planted anyway, and the great certainty of the age, the certainty that there would always be more cotton than there were spindles, came apart inside of 18 months. At Judah Hollis's store, the calico that had been 11 cents a yard in the spring of 1861 was 22 by the following spring and 38 by the autumn, when it could be had at all. Cotton bagging for baling and cotton rope for the hay press went first and never came back that year. The thread mills and the cordage works along the Ohio, which had been built on cotton and were not built on anything else, began running 4 days and then 3, and their agents went out along every road in 5 states looking for fibre of any kind: flax, hemp, jute, nettle, ramie, ragstock, anything with a staple on it that could be spun. And in a country of 6,000 farms where the flax straw had been burned every September since the first cabin went up, there was exactly 1 barn with any in it. Thaddeus Ordway of Ordway and Pell, fibre factors of Cincinnati, came up the creek road on the 14th of September, 1862, in a hired buggy. Having heard the thing first as a joke from a seed dealer at Vernon Landing, who told him there was a crazy widow out at Quill Creek who saved her flax straw, and having sat still for a moment when he heard it, and having asked the way. He was 50 years old and had been 40 years in fibre, and he had, that season, 3 mills on his books that were down to 2 days a week. Almira met him at the barn door with her sleeves pinned back and dust in her hair, and did not offer him coffee until the business was done, which he mentioned afterward for the rest of his life. He asked to see it. She opened the loft. He stood on the ladder with his head above the joists for a long moment without saying anything, and then he came up into it and walked down the length of the loft between the bound hanks with his hat in his hand like a man in a church. And he took down a hank at random and shook it out and held it to the light from the gable window and measured the staple against his own forearm. And it ran better than 28 inches unbroken, and he pulled it across his knuckles and twisted a strand and snapped it and looked at the break. And he asked her how it had been retted, and she told him, water in clay pools, cold, stopped by the nail test, and he asked how it had been pulled, and she said by hand, root and all. And he did not ask anything else for some minutes. Then he came down and offered her 22 cents a pound for the line and 9 for the toe, which was a fair price in a normal year and a robbery in that one, and Elmira Teague, who had been offered $9 for 1,100 pounds and $1.50 to haul it away, said no. She said it civilly, and she said it once. She told him she had written to 2 houses in Louisville that week, which was true, and that she was in no hurry, which was not, and she showed him the copybook with the dates and the pools and the yields per acre, and it was the copybook that finished it, because a buyer who has spent 40 years being lied to about fibre can tell in half a page whether he is dealing with luck or with method. Ordway went to 31 cents. On the 20th of September a second man came, a twine buyer out of Louisville named Elbert Sowash, who wanted tow and did not much care about line. And the 2 of them were in the township at the same time for 3 days and knew it. And Almira let them know it. And on the 24th, Thaddeus Ordway made the offer that she took, which was 40 cents the pound for the whole of it, line and toe together, ungraded and unsorted, taken as it stood in the loft, weighed on the public scale at the oil mill at Vernon Landing, and paid in bank paper on the day of the weighing. The weighing took the better part of 2 days, the 2nd and 3rd of October, and it was done in public, because the only certified scale in the township stood in the yard of the oil mill at Vernon Landing, where every farmer in 20 miles hauled his seed in the first week of October, and so it happened that the men who had watched Almira Teague's straw not burn for 2 autumns stood in a slow shifting crowd along the mill fence and watched it come across the scale. Platform in bound hanks, load after load, 11 wagon loads over 2 days, with Perry driving and the Wicklow girls stacking and Ottley Broughton keeping the tally against Ordway's clerk and finding 2 errors, both honest, both in the buyer's favor, both corrected. Almira had set aside 200 pounds of the finest line before the first load went out, and it stayed in the loft, because she had a use for it, and because she had decided some months earlier that she would not sell the whole of a thing she had made with her own hands ever for any price. What crossed the scale was 4,600 pounds. At 40 cents the pound it came to $1,840, and Thaddeus Ordway counted it out to her on the head of a flour barrel in the mill office at 4 o'clock in the afternoon of the 3rd of October, 1862, in bank paper and $40 in coin, and the mill clerk wrote the receipt and Judah Hollis witnessed it because he happened to be there buying. Nails, and the crowd along the fence was very quiet by then. It is worth saying plainly what that money was, because a figure by itself means nothing across 160 years. A good farmhand in that county in that year was paid about $15 a month and found. A yoke of broke oxen was $55, a milk cow $18. 160 acres of unimproved government land was $200 flat. Wilbur Dorsett's 310 acres, house and barns and stock and all, had been assessed the previous spring at $2,400. Eben Teague's note at the bank in Vernon Landing, the note that had stood over his widow's head for 3 years and 8 months and had eaten every dollar of margin that farm ever produced, was $340. Almira paid it on the 6th of October and took the paper and carried it home in her dress pocket and did not burn it, having by then a settled distrust of burning things, but put it in the Bible chest with her mother's shawl. Then she sat at the kitchen table for most of an evening with a copybook and a pencil, and she did not buy a piano or a buggy or a headstone finer than the one Eben already had. She bought seed flax, 11 bushels of it, Riga seed at $4 the bushel, because the ordinary seed had gone dear and the Riga was better fibre. She bought 200 feet of 2-inch plank and the ironwork for 4 proper brakes and 6 scutching boards. She paid the Wicklow girls' father's interest, $41, without telling them, through Hollis, who kept it to himself for a year and then did not. She bought a stove for the shed so the winter work could be done by women whose hands were not blue. And she put $860 in the bank at Vernon Landing at 4%, which was the first money any Teague had ever had on deposit anywhere, and the cashier, who had written her the dunning letters, was extremely civil. The township came to her that winter. It came in the way such things always come, sideways and one at a time, and with a good deal of talk about the weather first. Reuel Peak came in November and asked, with his hat in his hands, whether a man who had already burned his straw that fall had lost the whole year. And Almira told him the truth, which was that he had, and that a rick properly topped would keep 2 seasons, and that if he did not burn next September, she would show him the pools. The 2 Vandergrift brothers came in December together, which was how they did everything, and asked what a pond cost to dig. Old man Wicklow's widow came, and 3 men from over the ridge she had never met, and a school teacher from Pisgah who wanted to write it all down, and by the end of January 1863, Almira Teague had a standing arrangement with 14 farms in Quill Creek Township that she stated the same way to every one of them, that they would pull and ripple and rick their own straw and haul it to her ox-bow, that she would ret it and break it and scutch it and hackle it with her own works and her own hands and her own hired girls, and that the money it fetched would be divided 2 parts to her and 1 part to the grower, and that any man who thought that hard could go and find another pool in the state of Indiana and use it. Not one of them went looking. In the autumn of 1863 there were 412 acres of flax straw saved in that township, and not one bonfire on the creek road in the last week of September, and the air over the bottomland that year smelled of the oxbow and not of scorched hair. and men who had laughed drove past the pools with their loads and looked at the water with a kind of grudging technical interest, the way farmers look at anything that is making money in a way they have not yet learned. Wilbur Dorset was the last. He came in February of 1863, alone, on a bitter afternoon, and he did not make a joke, and he did not apologize, being a man who had no machinery for that, and he stood in the shed doorway watching the Wicklow girls scutch, and said at last that he had 310 acres, and had burned better than 200 tons of straw in his life, and would like to know what that came to. Almira did the sum on the doorframe in pencil while he watched, at the prices then ruling, and the figure was large enough that neither of them said anything about it, and she rubbed it out with her thumb afterward, which was the nearest thing to mercy that transaction allowed. Then she told him her terms, the same 2 parts, and 1, and he took them. And he hauled the first load himself the following October, and stood on the wagon in front of the whole township while he forked it off. He never once said she had been right. He said, for the rest of his life, that flax was a queer business, and that a man could not be expected to see everything, and that was as near as he came, and Almira Teague, who had learned early that a joke does not have to be taken back to be over, let him keep it. The price did not hold, of course. Cotton came back after the war, the way water comes back into a channel, and by 1868 flax fibre in the Ohio Valley was 14 cents, and by 1872 it was not worth the hauling. And the mills that had begged for it went back to what was cheap, and the pools in the Ox Bow silted and went to cattails and were a curiosity by the time Joniah Teague was a grown woman. But the note was paid, and the 12 acres that had been rented out on the thirds came back into the family, and 80 more acres of creek bottom were bought outright in 1865, and Perry Teague, who had built a flax brake out of a broken hay ladder at 12 years old, was a maker of agricultural implements at Vernon Landing at 30 with 11 men working for him. And Juniah, who had sorted fibre with wet sheets hung around her because her lungs were weak, taught school for 4 years, and then kept her mother's books until her mother died. Almira Teague lived to be 79. She wore linen of her own, making all her life, plain and heavy and the color of oatmeal, woven from the 200 pounds she had kept back and from what she kept back every year after, and she was buried in a shroud of it. Her mother's hackle, the block of iron teeth carried out of Coleraine in a shawl in 1822 and useless in America for 38 years, hung on the wall of the shed until the shed came down in 1891 and is in the County Museum at Vernon Landing now, with a card beside it that gets the date wrong by 2 years and does not mention her name at all. What it does say, in the small print at the bottom, is that in the autumn of 1862 a widow of Quill Creek Township sold 4,600 pounds of flax fibre for $1,840, being the produce of straw that her neighbors had burned as trash, and that is enough of the truth to be going on with. And she would very likely have said so herself.